all that anger, if somebody's insulting you, you can't get it out in like a little shove or a push or anything like you can in football. Yep.
Yeah, no, and the mind games are really interesting in volleyball. It's
Oh yeah,
definitely a
it's all
psychological
mental.
sport. But all right, so this is what happened. All right, this is one of the craziest stories. So they started slowly, like they lost the first set, and it wasn't looking good for them. And Maria Luis started shouting some really nasty insults, and the Brazilians complained to the referee, and he gave her a yellow card, and then they'd get another yellow card later. But over time, the match was very close. I went to a fifth set, and by then you could see that the name calling had really started to work on the Brazilians. They were angry. They were overplaying. They were too aggressive. Their body language, you could see they were really out of their heads. And at the same time, you could see the impact it had on the Cubans, which is they kind of got that swagger they always had back, and they started playing with a lot more confidence. So in the end, they wound up winning this match, and the Cubans did. They just eked it out in the fifth set. But there was so much emotion and so much anger in the room that afterwards, in the tunnel, in the locker room in Atlanta, one of the players bumped another player, and it turned into this giant brawl. And I mean, there were punches, they were throwing things. It was really awful. They had 10 Atlanta police had to come to break this thing up. And it took them a long time to separate these teams. So this was one of the worst things that ever happened in volleyball. Volleyball officials were horrified. It was a big embarrassment. The Cubans were booed at the medal ceremony. And, Maria Luis was really vilified as the ringmaster for this. So I went to Havana and I asked her about this. And I said, how in the world is that leadership? That just seems like something we're all taught not to do. And what I learned from her is something that I think is important for all of us in our careers. I'm not advocating what she did. I'm not celebrating what she did. You shouldn't do things like that. It violates the spirit of the rules. There are things in business you shouldn't do. But here's the thing. Here was her motivation. She wanted to keep her team going. She wanted to win. She wasn't angry. It wasn't personal. It was what they call instrumental aggression. She didn't want to hurt anyone. She wanted to help her team. If people got hurt along the way, fine. But the real goal was to win. And she told me something that really surprised me that I had to go fact check because I wanted to make sure it was true. She said that during this exchange, all she was the only member of these two teams who was trying to break up the fight. She didn't want anyone to get hurt. She had reverted back. She left the rules of sports and reverted back to the rules of polite society where you don't fight. She was trying to separate the two sides. She understood that there was a difference. There's a kind of aggression that's hostile and negative, and there's a kind of aggression that is important in sports and sometimes in business where you have to push things as far as you think you can push them to get away with them in order to sustain a winning effort. And again, this is difficult to wrap your head around, and it's hard for me to tell people what to do or what not to do. But I think we all know that there are times in a collective effort where you need to push things right to the edge of what's acceptable. And these captains never hesitated to do it. And what I saw was that was the common thread. The aggression they had was part of this emotional control that you mentioned. They didn't do things out of anger. They never acted out of personal anger or hostility. Everything they did, even if it looked like they were angry, even if it looked like choking your coach is not something that you do if you're not angry, right? But they weren't. It was tactical. It was designed to do something larger to help the goal of the group. And I think the lesson for people in business is if you see someone who does these things, don't immediately disqualify them from leadership. You just have to take a really hard look at why they did it and what their goals were, because sometimes you can be thrown off from a potentially great leadership candidate by behavior that looks really negative, but is actually coming from the right place.
I mean, the question of morality in sports is something that has actually been studied. So you mentioned there was a study in Berkeley in the 80s where they talked to athletes and they talked about, morality within competition, like what kind of behavior is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And it seems like they all came out with the same conclusion that if you're trying to hurt people just for the sake of inflicting pain, that's not okay. But roughing them up for the purpose of rattling them or distracting them, or to your point about meeting some sort of end goal, that was okay. So it's interesting. It's like when you think of that in the business context, some of the implications for that kind of open a lot of doors that I think people might think were previously closed because they're trying to adhere to sort of a strict moral behavior.
It's true. It's called the game frame, and that's what the researchers called it. They pointed out that the rules of sports are different from the rules of polite society. If you're in a hockey rink, you can punch somebody in the face, and
Oh
that's
yeah, and they
allowed,
do.
and they do. And
Yeah.
there's a penalty for that. You go to the penalty box, but it's contained within the rules. Whereas 2 feet away, if you did that in the stands, you're going to go to jail.
Mm-hmm.
So, but these great athletes understand that this game frame is different. The thing that these athletes had that others didn't, I found a lot of great leaders who they were very aggressive in competition, but also off the field. They got in trouble. They got in brawls. Roy Keane, who was the great captain of Manchester United, is my favorite example of this. He was famous for being a great aggressive player on the field, but off the field, he would keep getting arrested in bar brawls. He just wasn't able to shut that anger off.
Mm-hmm.
The difference with these great leaders, they understood the context. So when they were in the game frame, they would do things they would never do off the field. But the minute the game was over, like Maria Luis, it just switched off. They went back and they reverted to the rules of polite society. They understood that there was a difference. And that is incredibly important and something that that's hard to find and hard to understand when you see it. You have to look really closely to make sure that you understand what you're seeing in these cases. And aggression is important. And, you look in the business world, a lot of people look at Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs is someone who would routinely bring people to tears, because he was so hard on them for their work and their products. And a lot of people would look at him from outside the context of business and say, he's a jerk. He's not a role model. He's not someone you want to emulate as a leader, as a corporate leader. But when you think of it in this context and you think about a very competitive business and his desire to build the best products he possibly could, you had to wonder, was he a jerk, or was he just pushing the limits of what's acceptable in business to the outside edge? And that's a question we can all spend some time thinking about.
Yeah. Well, you know how they say all's fair in love and war. Well, Tony at his business event, he starts off day one. He says, "Look, business is a battlefield. It's war, and in order to survive, you need to be a gladiator. That's not to say that there aren't any rules, but if you know the rules and you know how to succeed within that framework, and also, bringing in your own talents and your own resources, it's like that's really the formula for success." And he, of course, uses Steve Jobs as a great example of a visionary leader, someone who had that end result in mind and would do whatever it would take in order to get his company to that.
Yeah, that's a great example.